You are listening to Draw 4 Podcast. Good tidings, and thanks for joining us. My name is Joseph Dunlap. I'm executive producer of Draw 4 Podcast and featured writer for Manaleak.com.
I'm Brenda Smith. I stream on Twitch, and I play Limited.
I am Jared DiMartini. I am owner and tournament organizer of The Gathering Place in Abilene and San Angelo, Texas, and a Limited aficionado.
I am Steve Wise. I'm a level 2 judge in Bettendorf, Iowa, and I am a Pauper Cube owner.
Well, I hope that when we get to card discussion, you'll tell us what cards you're most excited about for your cube.
More than happy to do that.
Awesome. So here we go. Upkeep. The upkeep is sort of the warm-up for the episode, and today we're going to be talking about the cards and synergies we're most excited for the pre-release of Shadows over Innistrad, as well as the upcoming sealed Grand Prix Albuquerque. We're going to focus primarily on what we as players are most excited for in the uncommons and the commons and the synergies of the set. What's the traps? What's the standard for a common or an uncommon? Brenda, you get to go first. What are you excited about for the pre-release?
Playing Magic. Actually, I'm very excited because the initial Innistrad was my first attempt at competitive level. So coming back to it's really interesting. And I think that we'll see a lot of similarities between the way that the old Innistrad played out and the way that this one does, in that more so than a lot of formats, draft and sealed are going to be very, very different, particularly in the way that synergies come together. As an example, I think Madness is going to be really powerful, particularly in draft, because you can build around it. But Delirium, not so much. I think in sealed, it could be a problem for people where they see this interesting new mechanic. It sounds powerful. They have a couple powerful cards, but needing the 4 different types can be problematic in Limited to really have access to those cards. So I think it's going to be really important for people to not try to force something, just that you think is going to be fun. I'm also really excited to have flip cards back. The werewolves were always good to me, so I think they're going to be very powerful, and I think for players, especially those that haven't played with werewolves before, something we'll really need to consider is spells you keep in your hand to make sure you can flip or not flip a creature. There are a couple particularly uncommon cards like Breakneck Rider that are very powerful and can completely swing a game. That card gives +1/+0 and trample to attacking creatures. So if you can't stop it from flipping, combat changes dramatically. There was a pre-release done by Loading Ready Run and Wizards of the Coast that ran, where they actually had people take the pre-release kits and play. And interestingly enough, every single of the 8 players they had played red. So I'm very interested in seeing how powerful my red pool is, and seeing if it was just a chance thing that happened, or if it is really the most powerful color of the Limited format.
I have been practicing just looking at sample pools and that kind of thing, and what has looked really strong is Call the Bloodline. Now, you said play all the red, so it may be that if you have a really strong red, like flip cards and vampires and madness pool, then maybe you won't be splashing black, but I've seen a lot of Call the Bloodline do some work in different pools and have a lot of synergy with madness. You get a lot more than you pay for.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think another thing that will end up being important is the amount of haste, particularly in red, that seems to be in this format. So it's going to be really important to keep in mind what your opponent could have in their hand to make sure you don't just lose. There's the creature that, and I can't remember the name, that stops a creature from blocking.
It's a Voldaren Duelist, 3 in a red for a 3/2 with haste.
So, and that can just completely, you think you're safe, I'm at, 10, I've got a blocker back, I'm okay. Not so much. So I think that's where this is going to be a really skill-intensive format, which is I'm really excited to dive in and see all the intricate plays between the cards and lines of play you can take. Do you hold something back? Do you wait? And see how it goes.
Yeah, it is pretty skill-intensive. Just the pools I've looked at, it's been difficult to come up with a combination that is strong enough in the strategy it's trying to accomplish, and often it seems that werewolves and vampires is the strength, but then there's other strengths. Jared, what are you looking for as far as uncommons, commons, synergies, and so forth? What do you look for?
Well, one of the first things that I do is I only look at commons and uncommons because you're going to be playing with the majority of those and maybe 6, 7 rares depending on if you get lucky. So all of my analysis is on the common and uncommon level, and I'll just take the rares as they come. It adds a little bit of mystery to the format because I don't even read them, so I don't know what I'm going to get. Looking at this new sets, I always look at power and toughness first to see how creatures stack up, where the creatures are, and where their power and toughness average out to be. Because the higher average power and toughness you have, the stronger your creatures are. So it's not a surprise that red was popping up a lot. Common average power of red's 2.7, it leads all colors. And then 2.3 on the defense. That ranges down. Black is also pretty powerful at 2.5, 2.5 at the common level. Black actually is the strongest of all the colors at the uncommon level, at over 3 power per creature and almost 3 toughness per creature. It looks like the next thing I like to look for is what the magic number is. Where's the magical power and toughness to see how good your creatures are or are not going to be. And I believe that Sanguinary Mage, 1 in a red for a 1/3 prowess, I think that's going to be your baseline. I think that in this particular format, unlike first Innistrad, 2/2s are not going to get it done. I'm a little wary of non-flying tokens as well, because there's just a lot of things out there with the 3 toughness, and 2 power is just not going to punch through them. And this guy's an example of that. As a 1/3 at common, he can easily be moved up to a 2/4 and just eat a bear. So I think that you're going to be wanting to play creatures that have a power of 3 if possible, and green, black, and red seem to be the colors that have the most of those. Regrettably, blue, at only 17 playable common or uncommon creatures, has the fewest number of creatures. White common's average power is 2.08, by far the lowest. So white and blue, while they have some cool mechanics going on, appear to be the lowest power and toughness. As such, I tend to be a little bit wary of that, because you want to, usually in Limited, especially in Sealed, at the pre-releases and at Grand Prix Albuquerque, which I'll be at, you want to be attacking. I also look at removal next. I like to separate removal into the 2 basic categories of good removal and bad removal. Bad removal I don't want to play, but in Sealed you probably will. But it looks like, as far as good removal is concerned, black and red each have 3 pieces of good removal, and then black has 3 pieces of what I would call bad removal, or very situational. Red has 4. So it doesn't surprise me that red's popping up a lot, because not only does it have one of the best power toughness ratios at the common and uncommon level, it has the most removal spells as well. So those are things I think to look for. Of the mechanics, which we'll go down to in just a little bit, I don't think Delirium is going to be very obtainable in the Limited format, at least in Sealed. It's just going to be very, very difficult to get that 4th card type into the graveyard. Delirium looking for 4 different card types. Creatures, instants, and sorceries are pretty easy. The other categories you're going to be looking for are planeswalkers, which you don't want your planeswalker to go to the yard, enchantments, or lands, and there's only 1 sackable land. So, and then artifacts, and there's only 2 sackable artifacts. So it's going to be very difficult to get that 4th card type in the yard. So I think Delirium may be a little bit of a trap, but the Madness looks like it'll be okay. There are a couple really powerful, very strong spells with Madness that you would just play without the Madness. When, especially for newer players or playing in Sealed, you can just sometimes take away the extra bonus mechanics and things and just look at the card itself. And if it says 1 in a black, kill something, or 1 in a red, do a great deal of damage, that's probably good enough, whether you get the Madness benefit or not. So I think that Madness cards, don't just set those off to the side. I think that they're very playable if the effect on itself is fine. There are a couple of cards also that I think are going to be interesting, whether they'll be kind of trap cards. I'll give a couple of them here. One of them is the flip card in white, Town Gossipmonger, costs white for a 1/1. You tap it, tap something else, and you get to flip it into a 2/3 that you can pump, give it +1/+0 by paying 2. This card I don't think is going to be very good, because I don't think 2/3s are going to be very strong on this format. There's going to be a lot of 2/3s and 1/3s floating around, and I don't think that sinking all of your mana into a flip card and sinking a turn into it to try to get to 3 power is going to be where you want to be. Another card, one that I like quite a bit, that I think is interesting and definitely a flavor win, is the Uninvited Geist, which is amazing. 2 and a blue for a 2/2 with Sculpt, which we'll explain in a minute. But when it deals combat damage to a player, you get to flip it into a 3/3 unblockable creature. 3/3 unblockable creatures are very good. In regular Innistrad, the 1/1 hexproof invisible stalker you could put equipment on and it was decent. This is a 3/3, so it already has built-in power. So I think that card may be a good finisher if you can stall the board out. One thing that I like to look at as well are how good are sweepers. I only saw 1 real sweeper in the format in black called Biting Rain. It's 2 black for a sorcery that gives all your creatures -2/-2, and it has Madness for 2 and a black. So using that Madness application, just set that aside for now. Let's pretend it doesn't have Madness. How good is giving all creatures -2/-2? And when looking at what that will kill, I did a little bit of math to find out. -2/-2 will kill 65% of the white commons and uncommons, 47% of the blue commons and uncommons, 55% of black, 57% of red, but only 40% of green. So if you're paired in the color combination of black-green, which I think is going to be very reasonable in this format, your -2/-2 board sweeper is going to kill only 40% of your green creatures. It may be main deckable. But if you're playing against a color like blue, which has a very high toughness, that card may slide its way out. I think a sweeper, especially with all these little 1/1 angels and things floating around, I think the sweeper is going to be fine to play. So if you open that card, I think it's probably okay as an include. And at the same time, you have that madness upside, so if you do wind up having to pitch it later, you can cast it for a little bit less, which I also think is going to be fine, and you can cast it at instant speed, which Steve will get to when he explains the madness mechanic. So I think that card is pretty good. Last thing that I think will be notable to pay attention to, especially if you're wanting to play the werewolves, which I recommend that you do. They're a lot of fun if you've never got to play with them, and they're very powerful. Getting a werewolf to flip means you have to not cast a spell on a turn. That's usually easiest done on your turn. You can just not play something and flip them. However, that also means you're not developing your board in any tangible way. So if you are going to play werewolves and you do want them to flip with some reliability, look to some cards that are like mana sinks, or something that's going to let you sink mana into it to get some sort of effect without casting. One of those is Olvawad Mysteries, 2 and a green for an enchantment, which I never play enchantments, but this may be an exception. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you investigate, which means you get to put an artifact out that can draw you a card for a couple of mana, but whenever you sacrifice a clue, you get a human token onto the battlefield, so you get dudes. So this is something that can sit on the board that you can sink your mana into to pay to get those clues cashed in later, that can actually get you some tangible board presence for very little input, very little work on your part. And there are a couple of those in green that will let you do that. There are a couple that let you sink your mana into. One last thing that I'll mention that I think is just a particularly good card, and why I think 2/3s aren't going to be good, is Graph Mole, which is creature type Mole Beast, which is my favorite creature type Mole Beast so far. 2 and a green for a 2/4. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, you gain 3 life. So 4 toughness for 3 mana. That, a 2/3, it can attack. It's really going to be something in green that you can put down and start just attacking with to either use combat tricks if you have it, bash your opponent, and then if you can set up a synergy where you get a couple of clues sitting around, you can just gain life with them. And there's nothing, paying 2 to draw a card, okay. Paying 2 to draw a card and gain 3 life, it's starting to get better. Oh, one last one I'll flash back to. If you do play some sort of control strategy, or even if you're playing kind of a beatdown strategy, I think in this particular format it's going to be a little bit slower, especially at the sealed level. I think that if you can get past the red onslaught, I think you'll get to a slower time frame. So, as such, be building your pools with the intent to have some sort of finisher in mind. I think that you're going to want to have a finisher as you're playing. There are a couple that are out there. A good one in black is Liliana's Indignation, X and a black sorcery. You put the top X cards of your library into your graveyard, and then target player loses 2 life for each creature you put into your graveyard this way. So if you've got your opponent to 8, and you've got a bunch of mana down, and the game's kind of stalled, you could just mill yourself for 6 or 7, and hit your opponent for 6 or 8. So I think that would be an interesting finisher, and one that I think savvy players will get to utilize if games go long. You may see that sitting in your sideboard, and I think that you can try to trot that guy out. I don't think you're going to get to splash much in this format. There's not a lot of fixing. There's only 2 green good fixing cards and only 1 sackable fixing land. So I think that this also is going to lend itself to be a 2-color format. As such, when you're looking at your multicolor cards, all of which will be rare or mythic, don't get too lonesome if you find the multicolor cards you can't play. Unlike in some of the formats we've came out of recently that have all sorts of different lands that you can utilize, there's not a ton of fixing other than the uncommon land cycle. There's not a lot of common ways to go get something. Notably missing, there's no Traveler's Amulet here to go fetch up a land, so you may be best to stick with 2 colors. But those are some of the things that I look for: how good the removal is and the creature power and toughness, because that's what you're going to be playing the most of, and then about how fast or slow this format looks like it's going to be.
There is one other sweeper, but it is mythic, so it's not even worth really considering. It's Descend Upon the Sinful. 4 a white and a white for a sorcery that exiles all creatures. If you satisfy Delirium, then you also get a 4/4 angel. It's not necessarily something to expect, but might be something if you're playing against somebody with white and it looks like they've got some angel synergy, maybe watch out for so you don't get blown out.
Right, something to note in this particular set, if you do find yourself in blue, which I feel will be the most underplayed color, although I could be wrong, there is an unsummon effect. So putting all of your eggs into one basket or building up some big creature with equipment or stacking a bunch of counters on something still doesn't seem like it's going to be particularly great because of the common level unsummon floating around. It just doesn't seem like that's going to be where you want. And I think if you are in blue, you should look to see if you've got that card, Just the Wind, 1 in a blue for an instant, return target creature to its owner's hand, madness for a blue, because I think that's going to get you out of a couple of problems that could arise in the set, because there are, I glance a little bit at the mythics, don't get me wrong, I've been following spoiler season, there are a couple of cards that are going to put down some things that are just going to be difficult to deal with, but unsummon is simply the best way to deal with that, especially if you get that crazy land, live the dream, sacrifice your 5 creatures and get your giant, terrible demon thing. You know, those are pretty hard to deal with. While the 9/7 has flying, lifelink, indestructibility, and haste, it does not have hexproof, so you just unsummon that, and you 5 for 1 your opponent.
That is definitely something to consider. If you see that land plop down, then don't play your unsummon, because I've already been sort of testing with some people post-rotation standard, and there is already a Coco deck I was playing against that was based around that. In limited, though, what a blowout if you can't unsummon that.
Yeah, he's really good. That's a Westvale Abbey, which lets you add colorless. You can pay 5, tap it, pay a life, and get a 1/1, or you can 5, tap, and sack 5 1/1s to transform it into this 9/7 or Mendal, Profane Prince, legendary demon creature thing where the art looks super cool. This, to me, is my pick for coolest looking foil of the set, so I'm very interested if you catch me at Grand Prix Albuquerque and you are lucky enough to open a foil Westvale Abbey. Please come show me. I want to see how pretty it is.
I wanted to comment, you said that there was 3 good removal spells in both red and black, and it's worth noting, there are 3 removal spells in black that straight up say, destroy. There's no condition except that one of them, Murderous Compulsion, requires that the creature be tapped. It's gonna be tapped. People are gonna be tapping things sideways. There are 3 straight up destroy something cards.
Right, and another reason why I think 3 toughness is kind of the magical number, you've got a deal 2 damage in red, and you've got Deadweight, which is an Innistrad callback. It's 1 black for an enchanted creature gets -2/-2. So your 2 toughness creatures, I think, are going to be very frail, where I'm typically a proponent of playing the value bear, your 2/2 with upside. I think you're going to want to get to the 3/3 range if possible, or play things that have 3 toughness, because that's just really going to clog the board. And when you're attacking with just giant creatures, which there are a couple, there's a 5/3 common in black, and there's a 7/7 uncommon in black, and there's a 5/3 in red. Green has a common 6/6 and a common 5/4. I mean, your opponent's 2/2s just aren't going to do well against that. So, especially if you have that black sweeper to get rid of the little hasty 1/1 riffraff stuff, you can really take control of a white-red player, which was my favorite color pairing in original Innistrad.
All right, Steve, it's your turn. What do you look for? What are you going to be looking for at the pre-release? What do you look for when you go to a sealed event?
For me, first off, this is Innistrad, and Innistrad just kind of resonates. You know, when Innistrad was first kind of shown off, and they were first showed off some of the cards at PAX, well, the first thing that really blew everyone's mind were the double-faced cards. I mean, they had like a couple double-faced cards, and they just kind of spun them around, and everyone just lost their collective minds. So I love the double-faced cards in this set, too, because they tell a story. You know, you can see, the chat gossip monger, which, as Jared alluded to, not the greatest card in the world, but, it tells a story of someone just kind of telling some people some things, and then all of a sudden this crazy rabble shows up, and everyone's going crazy with their pitchforks. The elusive tormentor, it's a throwback to a good old-fashioned vampire that turns into mist and sneaks into your house. The kindly stranger, which that's probably one of my favorite cards. It's just this kindly little old lady that I see. When I see kindly stranger, I think of the librarian in the first Ghostbusters movie at the very beginning, where she just kind of all of a sudden just goes from this nice little lady to crazy ghost that's trying to kill you. I love the flavor from the top down with all of these cards in Innistrad. For me, when it comes to sealed, kind of as Brenda and Jared both alluded to, I'm not picky. I'm not going and saying, I'm going to play Black-Red Vampires in Sealed, or I'm going to play the Investigate deck in Sealed. I kind of go by the old acronym BREAD, which I'm sure a lot of people, I'm hoping a number of your listeners have heard of, but for those that haven't, BREAD, BREAD, is an acronym for limited, specifically sealed. So you're looking for 5 specific things. First, your bombs. You want to see what your good rares and your mythics are. If you open kind of one of those junk rares, okay, that's unfortunate. But if you open one of those good, powerful bomb rares, if you open an Archangel Avacyn, you're probably going to want to play white because it's Archangel Avacyn. Next up, and this one Jared alluded to a lot, was removal. You want to be able to knock out your opponent's creatures. So look for things that say destroy target creature, deal damage to a creature, exile a creature, -X to a creature, even bouncing a creature. You're looking for all of that. Next up is evasion. Usually this is in the form of flying, but sometimes it can be skulk, can't be blocked, any trample, even anything that gets you through your opponent's defenses is very important. Flying, probably still one of the best mechanics ever in Magic, so if you can somehow scrape together blue-white flyers, go for it. Next up is acceleration, kind of going along with that fixing. Any way to kind of get further, get your mana a little bit smoother is definitely better. And then the D is what they call dregs, which is the rest of your deck to kind of fill in the slots. You want to get as many playables as you possibly can. So if you do have an Archangel Avacyn, but you only have, say, 8 white cards in your pool and the rest of your white cards aren't that good, Avacyn's probably going to have to take a seat probably to your dismay. Your opponents are going to be happy you're not playing Archangel Avacyn, but you're going to be sad. That's really what I'm looking for in Limited, is I'm just trying to build a nice, solid deck with a good number of creatures, a nice curve, and some good removal.
I like the basics that you focus on there, the bread. Get the pieces of a good deck together. I also like how much research Jared goes into trying to get the power and toughness averages for the rarities of each color. And then if you were to combine that information with just focusing on the basics of here are the pieces of a good deck, bread, that you can really do well. All right, now it's my turn. I have been looking over card pools, testing simple card pools, and trying to see where the synergies are and what's strong and what's forced. And it looks like there's a few archetypes that might have potential. Blue-black control, possibly because of the strong black removal cards, the blue flyers, the blue soft removal, blue counter spells, and discard to madness kind of synergy. There's also green stompies with clue synergy seems really good, especially if you can put in a good complementary color like black or white, maybe even red. The strongest pool that I personally had was not what I expected at all. I was thinking red-black vampires or something like that would be really good, and it does seem like that seems to be the strongest on the whole with its perfect synergy, although it does seem pretty pushed for the format. The best deck I played was actually blue-black control with Trail of Evidence, the enchantment that rewards you for casting instants and sorceries, and I had flying creatures as my win con, and it really ground out a good win in the game I played with it. It just doesn't seem like, on the whole, that's going to be as strong for someone who doesn't have the nut pool. And so then if you don't have that strong push in a direction like that, you might want to go Jared's direction and start going for where the big numbers are. Some of the big stuff is green stompies that I went up against. Any further thoughts, guys?
I do think in draft you're going to be able to craft some fairly crafty and specific decks. Back in old Innistrad and in the block, there were a couple of very interesting decks that you could craft in draft. The Spider Spawning deck, if you want to go all out with Dark Ascension, Lost in the Woods. So I think that in Sealed it's going to be a little bit different than when you start drafting, like Brenda had mentioned. I think that you're really going to be able to get some really fun synergies with some cards that are going to fall way down in the pick order that you'll be able to snap up and start really crafting a deck behind. I think that the draft format is going to be fairly deep and fairly fun.
One interesting thing was with the Trail of Evidence deck I was playing, I actually was able to get Madness fairly easily, simply because I had a land in my graveyard from discarding. I had a creature, I had an instant and a sorcery. Not something that everyone should expect for it to happen. Like, if you've got a way to get Madness in your deck, you feel like it'll be consistent, go for it. Otherwise, it does seem like a trap. Get something that has good numbers. If it has Madness on it, then okay, that's icing as long as it's got good numbers on it.
One of the better Madness fixers that I saw, and also a very funnily named card, as a lot of these are, is Fork in the Road, 1 and a green sorcery for search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal them, put 1 in your hand, put 1 in the yard, then shuffle your library. So 2 mana for a Rampant Growth, fine, and you just turn Madness on, it's just straight upside.
That does seem really good.
And that's at common. It's one of the few fixers in the format, but you could conceivably on turn 2 get a sorcery and a land into your yard, which are the 2 hardest to get in because a lot of the better removal is at instant speed. And let's face it, if you don't have creatures go to your graveyard, you've probably done something right. Or mulled the 3.
And as a great man once said, if you come to a fork in the road, take it.
All right, so moving right along, we go to this week's Manaleak article of the week. And we're not going to spend too much time on this, but this was a pretty well-received article. It was 8 great reasons why everyone needs to give Pauper Magic a try by George Mostyn. It's a great article that lists why Pauper Magic is worth trying. It starts with the obvious reasons, such as it's cheap to play, it's easy to get into, you can have multiple decks. You know, those are the obvious ones, but worth mention. But then he goes into detail about the thriving metagame of Pauper, the increased power level of commons, a decreased presence of Eldrazi, which one of you made a note in the Google Doc that Tron is part of Pauper, as well as Ulamog's Crusher, which both are mentioned in George's article. But on the whole, there's not an awful lot of Eldrazi there, but mostly it's the fact that commons are getting better and better and better and better, and that the metagame of Pauper is pretty diverse, so definitely worth checking out. We're going to also be talking about this article on 10 Minute Magic this week, because there was a lot of good feedback in the comments and on Facebook and all over the place. Have any of you tried out Pauper as a format?
I have.
What are your general impressions of Pauper?
I really enjoy Pauper as a format. You can do a lot of different things. The decks tend to be very streamlined and very powerful. Some of the aggro decks are only running 16, 17, 18 lands. The control decks maybe 22, 23 lands. It really depends on the deck, but Pauper is an eternal format, so you get to go all the way back to the beginning of Magic. You get your lightning bolts. You get your counter spells for your blue decks. You get, you're thinking Doomblade might be your card in your black deck. There are better things than Doomblade in the mono black control decks that are running around. Green, there are a lot of elves and a lot of mana elves, and elves is a deck in Pauper. So it's a really diverse metagame. I mean, one of my decks that I honestly really enjoy is Green-White Slivers. For people that remember Slivers from back in the day in Stronghold and Future Sight, and even a little bit in one of the recent core sets, that's a deck because the Slivers deck plays almost like the Merfolk decks of Modern and Legacy, because you're playing all of these lords with Sinew Sliver and Muscle Sliver and Predatory Sliver that pump the rest of your team. So unless you're in a Sliver mirror, which happens on occasion, and those tend to be kind of annoying, besides that, it's a fun and diverse format.
All right, since we're talking about Pauper, before we move on to talk about rules, Steve, why don't you tell us about your Pauper Cube and what you're excited to bring into that for the new set?
So for those that don't know what Cube is, I know some people are probably familiar with the Legendary Cube or the Vintage Cube that Magic Online runs every once in a while. A cube is really just a make-your-own draft format, and you can kind of set your own rules to it. So for Magic Online, their Legacy Cube is things that are only legal in Legacy, where their Vintage Cube includes all the Power 9 and a lot more powerful cards. My particular one is known as a Pauper Cube, and a Pauper Cube means I'm only running cards that are printed at common or have been printed at common in the past. So it's just like with the Pauper format, the cards have to be legal in Pauper, or at least have been printed at common. I actually have Treasure Cruise in my cube because Treasure Cruise is not quite as busted and limited as it is in Constructed, though I'm debating if I want to keep it or not. But for me, some of the cards that I'm looking at for my cube, for example, I'm looking for a lot of those nice, efficient cards, or nice removal spells or nice, efficient cards. For example, in white, Dauntless Cathar, which I think is probably going to be one of the white's best creatures. It's 2 and a white for a 3/2, but for 1 and a white, if it's in your graveyard, you can exile it and you get a 1/1 white spirit. So it has this second life after it's dead to come back and do something else, which is what I really look for in my cube, are those types of cards. So that, that's one of the big ones I'm looking at. I already have cards like Dead Weight in the cube. I have a card like Mad Prophet. Mad Prophet, for those that don't know, was another reprint. It was originally an Avacyn Restored, so the last time we went to Innistrad. Now it's back at Uncommon. If you wanted to make your own Pauper cube at home, but you don't have the old Avacyn Restored version, you can easily get the new one from Shadows over Innistrad, and it would be perfectly fine to play either in a Pauper cube or just the Pauper format in general. And personally, I do want the new art for Mad Prophet because the new art looks amazing. So that's really what Pauper Cube is and how my Pauper Cube works. Really, if you just want to make your own cubes, I've heard of budget-friendly cubes where the people make the limit of the card has to cost $5 or less, and if a card ever becomes more than $5, it has to get removed from the cube. You can do a lot of different things with Cube. Personally, I like my Pauper Cube, which is commons only.
And that's one of the things that's enticing about the Pauper format, especially for a lot of people who play more competitively, is Pauper, there's a lot higher premium on fun and innovation, and cubes are always very innovative in how you put things together. And those are some real big draws to Pauper. It's just a nice way to play. A lot of us started off playing kitchen table Magic with these are my cards, and a lot of them were commons. And it's a fun thing to go back and revisit and get a chance to give those commons some uncommon love, which we would need more of.
I remember that being one of your favorite phrases.
It's so good.
All right, let's move on to the community topic. This is our final bit of the episode, and Steve, as our resident L2 judge, you're going to explain to us the mechanics of Shadows over Innistrad and how they work as they come into this weekend with the pre-release.
Okay, so we've got 5 major mechanics in Shadows over Innistrad. We've got 2 returning mechanics in Madness and Transform, and we've got 3 new mechanics in Delirium, Investigate, and Skulk. So let's start off with Delirium. Now, Delirium, the way this works is you have to have X number of card types in your graveyard, and once you do, your card will get some kind of a bonus, and there are a couple different ones. Now, this is the first time we've really seen a card looking at multiple card types in a graveyard, not just one specific card type, but multiple card types. Since this one card in Future Sight that you may or may not have heard of called Tarmogoyf. I don't know, I think it's made some buzz in some formats, I'm not completely sure. But with Tarmogoyf, it actually referenced that there are 8 card types in Magic. Artifact, Creature, Enchantment, Instant, Land, Planeswalker, Sorcery, and Tribal. Now, Tribal was something that only has come up in Lorwyn and Morningtide, and it came back a little bit in Modern Masters 2015, but we're not going to probably be seeing any Tribal anytime soon unless Wizards decides to reprint Tribal in future sets. So really we're dealing with 7 different card types, at least in Shadows over Innistrad. For Delirium to be active, you have to have any 4 of those. So you have to have some combination of Artifact, Creature, Enchantment, Instant, Land, Planeswalker, and Sorcery in your graveyard. If you have a card that has multiple types, say like an Artifact Creature, it counts for 2. So if you have an Artifact Creature, a Land, and a Sorcery, you would have Delirium. Now, there are 4 different types of Delirium cards that you can see, and I've kind of broken them down. The first one is a static bonus. You can kind of see this on the card Moldgraph Scavenger. It's 1 and a green for a 0/4, but if you have Delirium, it gets +3/+0. So if you can somehow give it Delirium sometime in the middle of combat, maybe you attack with it, and then out of nowhere a land or an enchantment enters your graveyard, all of a sudden it's got that. It just kind of happens that way. The next kind is an activated ability, and you can kind of see this on a card like Reaper of Flight Moonsilver, which is a nice little flyer. It's a 3 white for a 3/3 with flying, and the Delirium bonus with it is you can sacrifice another creature to give it +2/+1 until end of turn. Now you can only activate this if you have Delirium, if you have 4 or more card types in your graveyard. Now, the activation only cares if you can activate it at that time. If for some reason you were to lose Delirium after the ability is activated, it doesn't matter. The ability is still on the stack. You will still get your +2/+1 even if you somehow were to lose your Delirium bonus. The next type that I have here is a spell replacement ability, which you can see on cards like Invasive Surgery. Invasive Surgery is kind of a new and improved version of an old card called Envelop. So Invasive Surgery is a blue instant that counters a sorcery spell, but if you have 4 or more card types in your graveyard, you get to also search that player's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of spells with that name, and you exile those cards. So the way this will work is the spell's on the stack, and when the spell resolves, that is when the card will check for Delirium. So again, Invasive Surgery is an instant. Let's say you have a creature, a land, and a sorcery in your graveyard with Invasive Surgery on the stack. Well, the card will look in your graveyard and say you only have a creature, a sorcery, and a land. You don't have Delirium yet. You have to have that 4th card. So in that case, you would only get to counter the spell. You would not get the bonus to exile all the cards from that player's library. The last type is the triggered ability, which you can see on cards like Tooth Collector, which is one of the ones that they previewed from the dual decks that came out. So the way Tooth Collector works, at least with its Delirium ability, it says at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Very nice limited card. The way that's going to work, however, is it's got what's known as an intervening if clause. So for the trigger to go on the stack in the first place, you need to have Delirium. So if you don't have Delirium at the beginning of your upkeep, it won't even go on the stack, even if you were to get Delirium later on during your upkeep. Now, if you lose Delirium before the ability would resolve, then you still don't get the bonus. So say you have something like Nephalia Moondrakes, which can exile itself from your graveyard to give all of your creatures flying. Well, if that was your only creature and you had Delirium on the stack, you would no longer have your Delirium bonus. So those are all the different types of Delirium that we have in Shadows over Innistrad.
Steve, if I could ask you a question real quick.
Sure.
How does the mechanic Delirium view the card Skin Invasion, which is a flip card which on one side is an aura enchantment and on the other side is an insect horror creature? If it was in the graveyard, if I discarded it to some effect, it was sitting in my graveyard, or my creature it flipped and my creature had died and it's sitting in the yard. If I had a land, an instant, and this in my yard, would I have Delirium?
So Skin Invasion and all double-faced cards only look at the front side of the card when it's in any zone besides the battlefield. On the battlefield, a card can be transformed. In all other zones, it has to be front side up. So even though Skin Invasion transforms into this insect horror, Skin Shredder, which is, again, awesome flavor, in your graveyard it only counts as an enchantment. It does not count as an enchantment creature like we had seen previously in Theros block.
Thanks.
Any other questions about Delirium?
Yes. When does the check occur with Invasive Surgery?
So again, Invasive Surgery checks when the spell is on the stack. So when you cast a spell, just like because this is a blue spell, there could be Counterspell Wars or any other spells cast. Once everyone's done responding and the spell resolves and the spell effect is happening, that is when the check occurs. So the spell is still on the stack when it's resolving. It is not in your graveyard when the spell is resolving. So, if you do not have an instant in your graveyard and you have 3 other card types, when Invasive Surgery or any other spell with Delirium, I think was descend upon the Sinful, that's another card with that where it has Delirium as a bonus on top. It will look in your graveyard and say, do you have Delirium without this card? So next we have Investigate. So Investigate's a new mechanic that I think kind of has a bit of a throwback to cycling, which we've seen in a number of sets over time. But we have both spells and abilities, things like Bygone Bishop, which says whenever you cast a creature spell with convert a mana cost 3 or less, you get to investigate. And what Investigate means is you put a colorless clue token on the battlefield. And a clue token is an artifact. It has no converted mana cost. And each clue token, and there's 6 of them, I think there's 6 different token arts that you can collect them all. And a clue has, for 2 mana, sacrifice this artifact and draw a card. So it kind of replaces itself. It's kind of like, other spells, things like Expedite and Slip Through Space that we saw in Oath of the Gatewatch, which allowed you to draw a card immediately. This kind of has a slower version to draw a card for an extra 2 mana, but usually it can help make cards a little bit more playable and helps keep the cards flowing in a lot of cases. Now, if you have a spell with Investigate on it, something like, say, Expose Evil, which is 1 and a white, to tap up to 2 target creatures and investigate. If that spell is countered for whatever reason, either because the targets are no longer legal or the opponent casts a counter spell, you will not get to investigate, since investigating is part of the card. And if you don't investigate, you do not get a clue token.
It seems like a very good way if you're playing with Werewolf to spend your mana and not cast spells to get to draw. Although, it'll be interesting to balance because having 9 clue tokens on the battlefield isn't going to be any more useful than 3, more than likely, because you still have to spend mana and time to draw those cards. So it'll be interesting to find what is the right balance. I hope it's not 0. The investigate mechanic, flavor-wise, I think is one of the best, if not the best, new Transforms returning, but new mechanics to the game for Innistrad. So I'd like to see it at least get utilized somewhere. I'm sure it will in Limited.
I was going to say 9 to 10 clue tokens kind of sounds nice and standard if you have a gear per Aether Grid.
Which is what I'm going to be playing.
I'm just saying.
It's actually quite fun to have Thopters and clues tapping down.
Aether Grid made my Origins Day 2 Grand Prix deck as my 23rd card, so it can get there.
Nice. Alright, so next on the list is Skulk.
Skulk, yeah. So Skulk is kind of the new blue-black combat ability. I think they've been trying to find a nice blue-black combat ability for a while, and looks like they finally found it. So it's not necessarily just found on blue and black, but I think that's where it's primarily going to show up. So a classic example is something like Furtive Homunculus. It's 1 and a blue for a 2/1 with Skulk. And Skulk simply means that this creature can't be blocked by creatures with greater power. So Furtive Homunculus is a 2/1. It can only be blocked by creatures with 2 or less power. Now again, we just said it has to be blocked by creatures with 2 or less power. Once that creature is blocked, it is blocked. So we talked a little bit earlier about Moldgraph Scavenger when we were talking about Delirium. So naturally, it's a 0/4. So if you attacked with your little homunculus and I block with my little fungus, that's perfectly legal. Now, let's say after I've declared blockers, I give it Delirium. Maybe I sacrificed an enchantment and sacrificed a land. Something happened where I was able to give it Delirium. All of a sudden, I have a 3/4. But it's still blocked. It's still a legal block. So, unfortunately, the homunculus is going to have a bad time. It's the same concept of once something is blocked, it is blocked. It does not matter what happens afterwards. If you have 2 creatures who aren't flying and all of a sudden one of them gains flying, but it's already blocked, it doesn't matter. It tries to fly up, but they're already kind of fighting each other.
It grabs it by the ankle.
Something like that.
Okay, so what's next on the list?
I believe next on the list is our first returning mechanic, which is Madness. So Madness has kind of changed just a little bit since we originally saw it. It was originally in Torment, which was in Odyssey block. Torment being, I think, the first and only time they've ever really color shifted hard to a single color, that being black. But Fiery Temper was actually one of the original Madness cards from that set, and it now makes its comeback in Shadows over Innistrad, this time showing up Avacyn's Fiery Temper. And the card works exactly the same. It just has a little bit of a functional difference, and luckily for us now, it has much cleaner reminder text to let us know how the card works. So let's look at Fiery Temper. It's 1 red instant, and Fiery Temper deals 3 damage to target creature or player. Just on those stats alone, it's a great limited card, could even see constructed play. But what makes it great is the Madness ability. So what Madness means is if you were to discard this card for any reason whatsoever, you discard it into exile. And when you do, you cast it for its Madness cost, or you put it into your graveyard. Before, it was optional whether you wanted to discard it with Madness or not. Now it is a requirement. If you have a card with Madness and you discard it into exile. Now, something to note about that is it says when you do, cast it for its Madness cost. Whenever you see the words when, whenever, or at, that signifies a trigger. So there is a Madness trigger that goes on the stack. So a card with Madness doesn't automatically get to go straight from discard to exile to the stack and no one gets to do anything. There is a Madness trigger that people get to respond to. So if you have a card that can say, pull something from exile and put it into someone's graveyard, I don't know, something like a processor, I don't know where that came from. If you have a processor and can somehow process something at instant speed, you can take that card out of exile and put it into someone's graveyard.
It's quite nasty. It's pretty similar to processing things like Rift Bolt and so forth. Just
exactly.
Very, very nasty.
Except the timing's a little bit trickier, but very similar.
Yeah, this one is a very good piece of removal spell. This is a very good, when you see one of these in red, this is something you want to play. That's why they made it double red, to make you have to pay for. But this is one of those Madness cards that, as Steve mentioned, even without the Madness, 3 damage for 3 mana at instant speed in red in limited is good. And then the Madness is just bonkers.
Now, the other cool thing with Madness that I almost forgot about mentioning is Madness gets around timing restrictions. It just says if you were to discard it into exile, and when you do, you can cast it for its Madness cost. It doesn't matter when that is, as long as you're discarding it. So say you have something like Incorrigible Youth, 3 red for a 4/3 with haste, and it has a Madness cost of 2 and a red. Well, if you have something like a free discard outlet of some form, or some other way to discard a card from your hand, and your opponent's attacking with, say, a 2/2, all of a sudden you can discard it, pay your 3 mana, and you've got a surprise blocker out of nowhere. Or if you really want to be fancy, you can wait until you can go up to 8 cards in your hand and discard in your cleanup step and cast a spell. But
that actually had occurred to me.
If you really want to get fancy, but I don't think people want to get that fancy.
You mean Manaless Dredge fancy?
Sure, Manaless Dredge fancy.
Actually, kind of sounds like Jared might be right as far as all our examples being things with 2 toughness dying.
Yeah, a lot of stuff is dying it too. Catalog is a really good blue card that's gonna, I think, really help out Madness, especially such as if you're playing blue-red for some reason because you've never got off it, Fiery Temper, because you can catalog at instant speed and pay 2 and a blue, draw 2 cards and discard a card, discard your Fiery Temper and cast it for 1. So on their turn with your 4 mana, you can draw 2 cards, bolt something, and flip all their werewolves back over. Which we'll come to that example in a moment. What if I bolt something and then it flips back over?
So what was the question, Jared?
So if I live the dream and I tried to bolt something that flipped back over, say somebody had a flipped werewolf on the werewolf side and is attacking me or something with it, and I were to manage to cast the 2 spells to get it to flip back, the timing on the flip, and when does that damage fall off of it?
So damage always falls off at the cleanup step. The cleanup step being after the end step. It's the last thing you do during your turn. That's when all of your until end of turn effects wear off, and that's also when all the damage would fall off. So if you were to cast a Fiery Temper, say during someone's upkeep, right when a creature's about to transform back from a dark side werewolf into a light side werewolf with less toughness, it would still have that damage marked on it. And we'll talk about Transform here in just a second.
Brenda, any questions about Madness?
No, I actually look forward to really playing with it. It seems, especially in draft, super powerful if you can build the right deck around it, because it's so much value. I'm excited.
All right, then. I guess it's time for Transform.
Yeah, Transform, again, this is, as I said earlier, this was what blew everyone's mind the first time around when we came to Innistrad. It was really their flagship mechanic. The thing with Transform cards is they do not have that traditional Magic back with the Deckmaster logo on it. There's another card on the back side. These function in a very similar way to the Origins Planeswalkers, things like Jace Vryn's Prodigy. Once you meet the Transform condition, it will transform. Now, with those Origins Planeswalkers, they actually exile and then re-enter the battlefield. None of the cards in Shadows over Innistrad actually exile. They just stay on the battlefield and then transform over, which actually does lead to some interesting changes, which we can talk about a little bit later. But once you meet the conditions, be it Delirium, or if you don't cast a spell, or if a creature dies, whatever the condition is, then you transform your cards. Now, we've talked a lot about werewolves. Let's talk about that briefly. So let's look at one of your pretty standard issue werewolves, a Hinterland Logger. It's 1 and a green for a 2/1, kind of like a grizzly bear except a human werewolf. And at the beginning of each upkeep, if no spells were cast, you transform Hinterland Logger, or really any werewolf. So again, neither you nor your opponent can cast a spell. So if no spells were cast, then the werewolf will transform over, and in this case we have a Timber Shredder, which is a 4/2 with Trample. Now, to turn a werewolf back, again, it looks at the beginning of each upkeep, if a player casts 2 or more spells last turn, transform. And it will look through the entire turn, whether the werewolf had entered the battlefield during the middle of the turn or at the start of the turn or what have you. It will look through that entire turn. And it will look for a single player having cast 2 or more spells. So if I cast a spell and my opponent casts a spell, we've each only cast 1 spell. The werewolf will not flip over. Now, there have been a couple of little changes to double-faced cards. So when Archangel Avacyn first spoiled, I remember seeing a post that someone made saying, hey, if you have like 14 creatures and they all die simultaneously when you have an Archangel Avacyn, it's going to transform 14 times and kill your opponent in one shot because it's going to be transforming back and forth. And Matt Tabak at the time, because the mechanics article had been released saying, well, that's assuming it's under the old rules. And who says we're using the old rules? And what that was really referencing to were some old cards from the original Innistrad block, specifically things like Thraben Sentry. That was a classic card that had some feel-bad moments to it because it said whenever another creature you control dies, you may transform Thraben Sentry. And especially on Magic Online, sometimes people would say yes twice, and it would flip and then flip back. Another classic example was at the Community Cup a few years ago. Michael Jacob had built a deck using Strionic Resonator, which can copy triggered abilities, and he had Huntmaster the Fells. So what he would do is he would copy the transform trigger, and whichever side it was on, either Huntmaster the Fells or Ravager the Fells, it would flip and then flip back immediately. Under the new rules that they've set up, that is no longer an option. If a card would transform and there would be multiple triggers that would be causing it to transform, only the first one will resolve. So again, let's go back to that Archangel Avacyn example where someone said there were 14 triggers on the stack that would make it transform. The first one would resolve, Archangel Avacyn would transform and do her 3 damage to each other creature and each opponent. The rest of those triggers would not cause her to flip and flip back and flip and flip back and flip and flip back. You would only get the one. In most cases, this is probably only going to mean that in like a lot of cases, again, like werewolves, you're really not going to be flipping cards back and forth. The one place where this can get a little confusing would be something like Elusive Tormentor, which says you can discard a card to transform it. You could activate that ability multiple times to, say, discard multiple cards, maybe get some madness abilities if you really were up to it and really felt frisky, but it would only transform once. It would stay Elusive Mist even though there were to be multiple activations to transform Elusive Tormentor. Think of it as you're not transforming the card anymore, you're transforming Elusive Tormentor. You're not transforming Insidious Mist. Insidious Mist has its own transform ability and its own transform trigger.
So in essence, after the first trigger, the next one in line will check to see whether it's still the correct side of the card. It'll say no, and then it'll be disappointed, turn around and walk away.
Exactly. Instead of saying transform this card, it is transform this face of the card. Is probably the best way to think of it. So it's transform Archangel Avacyn. If you're on the side of Avacyn the Purifier, you can't transform Archangel Avacyn because Archangel Avacyn's on the other side.
That could lead to a situation where, let's say you're not playing werewolves per se, where it checks to see how many spells were cast in the previous turn to flip back to the good side, the light side. What if you were to have one of the transform cards that you can have direct control over whether it flips back over, whether there would be a strategic reason to do so?
Well, yeah, that's like Elusive Tormentor, which I think is not only a flavor win, but a card that does exactly that. I mean, if your opponent were to try to kill it in your main phase, you could just discard a card to it, ideally with Madness, and flip it over. Now it's hexproof and indestructible. You just swing in because it can't be blocked, and then you pay your 2 mana or your 3 mana, and you flip it back over and you hit them for 4, effectively dodging the removal. I can see Tormentor is not necessarily indestructible because you do have to pitch a card and spend a mana, and then spend 2 and a black mana, which is really the 4 mana it costs to cast it. So every time you want to protect it, you have to lose a card, so it's a 1-for-1 for your opponent, and then repay its mana cost to get the full effect. But you can do that in the same turn, because each card is a new name on either side. So that's definitely something that you can do, and it's going to eat up your whole turn. And, for 4 damage, your opponent may just start blocking. But still, it's still a very powerful effect to keep your 4-4 alive.
I could totally see that happening in Constructive, where you have already planned out what card it is you're going to pitch and pay its madness cost.
Right, you could just intentionally set it up. I mean, I could, go to my attack phase and then just discard that black card that you can madness out for 2 and kill something, destroy something if I wanted to, or fiery impulse something. And then, the red card, the 3 red that you can madness for a red, and then if I have 5 mana on my 5th turn, just flip this guy back over and get in for 4.
The second big change is actually with the converted mana cost. Let's say on Archangel Avacyn. She's a 3-white creature with Flash, Flying, Vigilance, and a bunch of other amazing abilities. But her converted mana cost is 3-white, or 5. When she transforms into Avacyn the Purifier. Previously, if you look at Avacyn the Purifier, there is no converted mana cost in that top right corner. Previously, that meant that the card's converted mana cost was 0. That is no longer the case. Avacyn the Purifier still has a converted mana cost of 5. So that means you can't use cards like Ratchet Bomb or Engineered Explosives in Modern to take out all the cards with converted mana cost 0 and take out all the transform cards and double-faced cards. You would have to have a CMC of 5 to destroy it. The last thing is regarding cards that would enter the battlefield transformed, but the card has no transform side. So this would be, again, in reference to cards like the Origins Planeswalkers. Let's take Jace Vryn's Prodigy, for example. I know I actually have a friend who plays some EDH, and he had built a deck where he had a Necrotic Ooze in his graveyard, and his Necrotic Ooze was consistently being given haste, and he had a Jace Vryn's Prodigy in his graveyard. Now, Necrotic Ooze says it has all the activated abilities of all creatures in your graveyards. So what he would do is he would tap the Necrotic Ooze to draw and discard, and then it would see that there were 5 or more cards in the graveyard. It would exile the Jace Vryn's Prodigy, or in this case the Necrotic Ooze, and return to the battlefield transformed. Well, under the previous rules, it couldn't be transformed because it only has the front side, so it would just return face up, and he was effectively able to mill himself out and get to his combo condition. That doesn't work anymore. So if you were to tap your Necrotic Ooze and it would exile, it would try to return transformed, but again, Necrotic Ooze doesn't have a backside, so Necrotic Ooze would just kind of stay in exile and hang out. Those are the major changes that you have to double-face cards.
Those are very good clarifications and a great explanation, Steve. Thanks for that. And hopefully that will clear up a lot of confusion as people start to play with these new cards and with the new rules for Transform and Madness and so forth.
Now, one last thing I did want to mention, Joseph, if I may, and this is especially important for people like Jared, who's going to Grand Prix Albuquerque, and knowing Jared a little bit, I know he loves playing his deck without sleeves. He's one of those people, it doesn't matter how expensive the cards are in his deck, he's probably not going to play with sleeves. If you're not going to play with sleeves, or even if you are going to play with sleeves, but they aren't completely opaque, that's fine. You just have to use what are known as checklist cards. Again, if you've played a little bit with Origins, you probably saw Planeswalker checklist cards. If you played the original Innistrad and Dark Ascension, you probably have seen them as well. There are 2 sets of checklist cards this time, one for the common uncommons, and one's for the rares and mythics. Personally, I always like to use checklist cards, even if I have opaque sleeves, because you never want to have it look like you're looking at the top of your deck and you're looking at the top of your cards to see what they are. I would just put the checklist cards in the sleeves or in your deck, so you, just for fun, you mark the little circle that they have on there and make sure it's fine. Personally, I always hold on to my checklist cards. I wouldn't throw them away with the tokens and the rules tokens. Hold on to them. You never know when they're going to come in handy.
And if you don't particularly want them, or if you bust a case and you have a whole bunch, take them to your local card shop and donate them so that they can have them for their events and to help there with their drafts. I'm sure that they would really appreciate it.
I know for most players it's actually pretty common practice, even if you are playing with opaque sleeves. It's like, my Jace is worth $80 to $100, I'm going to play with a checklist card.
And I've seen some people having some fun with checklist cards. The way you're supposed to do it is you're supposed to kind of circle in the one little dot next to the card, but I've seen people pretty much black out the entire rest of the card, just kind of leaving the one slot open for your one card to know what it is. I've seen some people, again, with Delver of Secrets, just kind of write across it in kind of big letters, "It's a Delver," just so they know what it is. I've seen people have some fun with the checklist cards. So I think I've even heard of people getting some of their checklist cards altered.
I was about to ask about that.
I think they have done that. So yeah, I'm pretty sure those exist as well. So people can have some fun with their checklist cards. They're not just for show. They do serve a purpose.
Altering your checklist card just sounds really cool.
Yeah, that's your next level. Before we move off of the the transform card, Steve, let me ask you to kind of explain something, especially maybe to players who never played an Innistrad before or haven't ever interacted with a Delver. Maybe they're just staying in Standard since Theros block and they're not sure. When can you flip transform card? Does it become summoning sick when it's flipping over back and forth? When during combat, when is that the best? How does that work when a card's flipping over? Are things falling off of the card if you've got counters or enchantments?
Transform cards never leave the battlefield unless they specifically say they do. Again, referencing the Origins Planeswalkers, they actually specifically say they exile and then return to the battlefield transformed. All of the cards in Shadows over Innistrad never leave the battlefield. So it's not like they quote, gain haste. Usually by the time they would transform, they've been on the battlefield for at least a turn, so they're not summoning sick anymore. Say you have a werewolf and it would transform at the beginning of your upkeep. It's not that it has haste, it's the same card and it's getting ready to attack.
All right, so if I had, 2 +1/+1 counters on my my Hinterland Logger and turned him into whatever, a 4/3, and then he were to flip and do a 4/2 with trample, those +1/+1 counters and the equipment or whatever still hang around, correct?
Yes, everything does flip around, and that even includes the equipment that transforms, like Neglected Heirloom, the 1-mana artifact that it equips for 1, gives the equipped creature 1/1, but if the equipped creature transforms, then you also get to transform Neglected Heirloom, and the equipped creature now has +3/+3 in first strike with an Ashmouth Blade. So the equipment would stay attached to the transformed creature, so you get like this double super bonus thing. So probably something good to put on your Avicinian Missionary, since that would probably be really, really sick.
Put your pictures online. Let us take a look at that. But yeah, knowing when to flip those werewolves, or for the cards that do flip manually, when you can force them to transform, it's real interesting. There is some gamesmanship and some gameplay there, and how to get your cards to the right side at the right times for the power and toughness. There's no Moon Mist in this format, but there are some things that will force changes in force transformations.
All right, now that we've gone over the rules, we are briefly going to have a segment of Ask the Judge. So everyone raise your arm and say, Judge!
Judge!
So, you don't have to, Steve. So what I did, I put a feeler out on the internet, and most of the response was actually from Draw Forecast members, guests and the like. The first question is going to be from me, though. It's one of those questions where I already know the answer, and most of you guys will know the answer anyway, but it's bound to come up. So in this scenario, I'm playing Wisp-Ward Elemental, and on my instep, I manifest Jace Friend's Prodigy. So first off, Steve, explain to people who may not understand this why Jace is not immediately a Planeswalker.
So when you have a double-faced card that is face down is different than transformed. A face-down creature is a 2/2 creature with no abilities and no converted mana cost. It does not matter if it's a morph or a manifest. The case of it being face down is practically identical, and for the case of this, it is identical. It's just how they can turn face up is somewhat different between morph and manifest. But just because it is face down, even though, yes, there's this Planeswalker looming, it is a face down creature. It is with no creature types. It is not a Planeswalker immediately.
So that's the thing that you were saying earlier. You really either need to have it in an opaque sleeve so they can actually legitimately be face down, or get a checklist card.
Exactly.
What is your advice to someone in that scenario? There's more to my question, obviously, but to someone at the pre-release who doesn't have a checklist and doesn't have sleeves, and they have a flip card.
Well, the nice thing is that when you open your packs of Shadows over Innistrad, you'll have all your cards, you'll get your basic land, and then they have that token slot in the back. Now, while you will be getting primarily, creature tokens, that slot will also be filled up sometimes by checklist cards. So hopefully, say you're at your pre-release, you'll hopefully get a couple of checklist cards in your pool, hopefully at least 1 or 2 that you'll be able to use, unless you open this crazy werewolf pool and you need 6, then maybe you can get a couple from your friends, or maybe the store has some spares. But usually you will need to use those checklist cards. So it's not like you will never have access to them. There should be some that you'll be opening up in your packs.
All right, so continuing with the question, So now I've got my face down Jace, Friend's Prodigy. It's a 2/2 with no abilities. It's been manifested. So I pay the 1 and a blue and I turn him face up. So now I'm playing against someone who can force things to flip. I'm playing a werewolf player in Modern, and he plays Moon Mist. And the first effect is transform all humans. So can you walk us just one last time on the different states that Jace goes through in this case, and why ultimately he ends up in the graveyard?
Yeah, this is not going to be a good time for Jace. So I actually want to bring up another another new card from Shadows over Innistrad, which is Arlen Cord. Arlen Cord is a 2-red-green planeswalker. She enters with 3 loyalty. And on her front side, she has an 0 loyalty ability that says to put a 2/2 green werewolf creature token onto the battlefield and then transform Arlen Cord. If you notice, on the backside of Arlen Cord, there is no planeswalker loyalty number or loyalty box like there is on the front. That's because when Arlen Cord transforms, she keeps all of her loyalty because she never left the battlefield. So in this case, we have a Jace Friend's Prodigy that is transforming because he is a human and he transforms, and he just transforms right over. Now, I keep mentioning that the Magic Origins walkers, they exile and then return to the battlefield. When you have a planeswalker entering the battlefield for the first time, they enter with that loyalty number that's in the bottom right. Jace never entered the battlefield to begin with. So he's on the battlefield with no loyalty whatsoever. And due to state-based actions, Jace will go to the graveyard.
Which is probably for the best. A disloyal Jace should find its way into the graveyard.
Very much so.
There's got to be a pun in there involving magic cards. We'll figure it out.
We will.
All right, Steve, the next question in the doc is actually one that you have come up with because it was a good question, and you've already been kind of talking about that, but Jace plus Madness?
Yeah, so this is actually a ability that's really come up a lot in social media. I believe if you look at the release notes that Wizards of the Coast came out with earlier today, they even reference it itself. But the common question is, let's say I have a Jace Friend's Prodigy, and I have 4 cards in my graveyard. And I go to activate Jace, I draw and discard, and I notice maybe that card that I just drew has Madness, and I want to get maximum value out of it. So I discard that Madness card. Unfortunately, due to the rulings of Madness, it goes straight to exile. So Jace's whole big text box is all one ability. So you draw a card, and then you discard a card. And when you discard a card, that's when it looks to see if you have 5 cards in your graveyard. Well, unfortunately, that 5th card went into exile because it's a card with Madness. So Jace will not be flipping if that 5th card has Madness. You have to have 5 cards already in your graveyard in that case for Jace to flip.
All right, so our next question is from Josh Kelly of the production team. Brenda, would you like to ask Josh's question?
Sure. Josh asks, if I have Harness the Storm on the battlefield, and I cast Lightning Axe with 1 in the graveyard, do I have to discard a card to cast the Lightning Axe that's in the graveyard?
So let's look at Harness the Storm first. Harness the Storm is a 2 and a red enchantment that says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell from your hand, you may cast target card with the same name as that card from your graveyard, but you still have to pay the costs. So, in this case, you have a Lightning Axe in your hand, and you have a Lightning Axe in your graveyard. You would still have to discard a card to the Lightning Axe in your graveyard if you wanted to use it from Harness the Storm. That being said, interesting interaction. Say you had 2 Lightning Axes and a random card in your hand. You could say, cast the Lightning Axe in your hand, discarding the second Lightning Axe as part of the cost. By the time the first Lightning Axe is on the stack, you'll have another one in your graveyard. When the spell resolves, all of a sudden, you can cast a second one, you can discard that 3rd card to cast the second Lightning Axe that you just discarded, and you can just kill 2 things for 2 mana.
What if that was a Madness card?
Then we have now we're just in Magical Christmas Land Value Town party time.
Yeah. Okay, so the next question is from Dove Millen. Jared, do you know this person?
I do. She is my event manager in San Angelo and studying to become a judge.
Dove has actually been on Draw 4 podcast before, and she was very gracious to give us a simple question that people are going to end up asking this weekend, and it is simply, if my opponent threw a card or an effect of some kind makes me discard a card with Madness, maybe a Pox or Thoughtseize effect, can I cast the card for its Madness cost?
Yeah, or maybe it's, you're in Standard or Modern or Legacy and someone has this thing called a Reality Smasher. Yes, you are still allowed to cast that card with Madness. Madness only cares if you discard the card. It does not care how that card is getting discarded. It just cares that you are discarding a card. It can be your effect, an opponent's effect. It could just be some judge walking by saying everybody discard a card. That's not really legal. But as long as something is forcing you to discard that card with Madness, you may cast it for its Madness cost.
And that question is appropriate because Dove handles Madness very well. She is simply the best.
Does she have Madness or deal with it on a daily basis?
She makes it to where it doesn't exist.
Ah, she's stifled?
Ooh, can you stifle in that? Alright, so I have a question. I'm going to Grand Prix Albuquerque, and I have a rules interaction question for a penalty. Let's say that I have OL Mysteries on the board, which is an enchantment, 2 and a green. And whenever you sacrifice a clue token, you get a 1/1 human soldier creature token on the battlefield. It does some other stuff, but that's the important part here. If I have a clue token on the field, and I pay 2 and sacrifice to draw a card, and my Mysteries triggers to put the 1/1 into play, and I reach and just draw the top card of my deck, and then reach to go put my 1/1 into play, what happens there?
So in a situation like that, and again, something like a Friday Night Magic or a pre-release would be a lot different than, say, a Grand Prix. It would depend on how you were sequencing it and what was going on. If you said, I'm going like sacrifice a clue, I'm going to draw a card and get a soldier, and you draw a card as you go to your token box to get your soldier, I would consider that what is known as out-of-order sequencing, which means you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, you're just doing it a little bit out of order, but not so out of order that it's going to ruin the game state and ruin everything and have the world come to an end. You're just you kind of did things a little bit backwards, but not significantly such that it would ruin everything. So in a situation like that, you're going to be fine. Now, if it was, say, you drew your card, you passed your turn, it's your opponent's turn, you said, oh, I forgot to get my human, I'm going to walk up to you and say, sorry, you missed your trigger, you don't get a human unless your opponent wants to give you one, and in most cases, the opponent's not going to give you a human creature token.
No humans for free in Magic.
Nope.
Okay, with that, then we move on to the community question. It is quite simple. What card are you most excited about opening at the Shadows over Innistrad Prerelease? You can give your reasons as well, so all of you get to answer. Steve gets to go first.
That's a great question. I would probably say Arlen Cord, just because that's just a cool planeswalker that just gets all the value. You can keep flipping her back and forth, getting wolves and lightning bolts, and plus it's a really, everyone just loves Arlen Cord. If I got that as my pre-release promo, that would just be cool, especially if I could build the werewolf deck to support her.
Oof, that's tough for me since I haven't looked at the rares and the mythics, which are really what I want to open all of those. I like to try new things. Of course, at the Grand Prix, a little bit different. I want the best cards, but I really want to play with a card called Behind the Scenes. I think that that's a very interesting and a deceptively powerful card that you could sneak into play and be pretty interesting. So, Behind the Scenes is 2 and a black for an enchantment. All creatures you control have Skulk, so they can't be blocked with creatures with greater power, and then you can pay 4 and a white and pump your team. I think that that's an interesting card. I want to see if it's good, and I like to explore, especially at pre-releases, with cards to see if they're good, so by the time we get to the Grand Prix, we know if cards are good or not. So that's one I want to open. I don't know if I'll be playing black-white, but if I do find myself in those colors, that's a card that if I had, I'd definitely insert and see if it's tampering with all of the blocking order and then putting an effect on the field that lets me pump all of my team is any good.
Well, Steve kind of took my answer. I think Arlen Cord as a competitive player is the card I will drool if I see as my pre-release promo. But I think because pre-releases aren't super competitive, I'm still going with a strong card, Archangel of Avacyn, simply because one of my dear friends has been an Avacyn fan forever, and when he saw the other side, he teared up a little bit. And I think just flashing her in and blowing creatures out of the water is just going to be so much fun, and we always end up playing at pre-releases, and I can just see me flashing that in and seeing him break just a little bit, and it's cruel, but will be hilarious.
That's why we play Magic, isn't it? To crush people's dreams?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay, so I've got 2 answers because I get to break the rules. I mean, obviously, I'd be okay with Archangel, Avacyn, or Planeswalker, so that's the obvious one because I can get value out of that. But as far as the pre-release itself goes, I just want as many Murderous Compulsions as possible. It's a common. I could get 2 to 3, and I'd be very happy. I mean, it's essentially a Doomblade for all intents and purposes, because things are going to be tapping sideways, so being able to discard and immediately kill something is really cool. Alright, now that we're at the end of the episode, we all get to say our goodbyes, and then we'll be out of here.
Again, this is Steve Wise, Level 2 Judge. You can find me at Komodo Drake on Twitter.
This is Jared DeMartini, owner of The Gathering Place. We can be reached on Facebook at The Gathering Place at either our Abilene or San Angelo locations. Make sure to keep your pre-release fun and have a great time.
This is Brenda. Thanks for joining us. You can find me on Twitch and Twitter at Brenda is Bored.
And you can find me on Twitter as Joseph_Dunlap. And I am always down to talk about things like my articles and episodes of 10 Minute Magic and Draw 4 Podcast. This has been Draw 4 Podcast. Until next time, we wish you good fortune, and may you draw well.